support our humanitarian resolution with a call for a swift ceasefire must understand that they bear some of the responsibility for what happened. The Brazil draft resolution, unfortunately, will not help to avoid such tragedies from occurring. There is no clear call in it for a ceasefire. This is a very important thing to de-escalate the situation on the ground. It's very important wording. That has been replaced with humanitarian pauses and giving unhindered access to UN workers. But that's not the same thing. Humanitarian pauses will not help to stop the bloodshed. It is only a ceasefire that will help to do this. Furthermore, the draft still has a number of political elements in it that push us to one side and do not talk about the absolute unacceptability of the attacks on civilians in the Gaza Strip and also as on civilian objects. The importance of this is absolutely crystal clear for everyone right now. And so we have proposed 2 amendments to address these issues. The first is a unambiguous call for a stop on the indiscriminate attacks against civilians in the Gaza Strip and on civilian objects, including the attack on the Al Ali hospital, that airstrike, and also the strong condemnation of the imposition of the blockade. The second adds to the OP a new point on the call for an immediate, durable and fully respected humanitarian ceasefire. If these are not included in the text of the document, it will not help to address the tragic, devastating humanitarian situation in Gaza. Rather, it will just worsen the divide in between members of the committee and will polarize the positions of members of the international community. We would urge members of the Council to vote in support of the amendments proposed by Russia. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. Would any other member wish to take the floor? I see none. Members of the Council have before them proposed amendments submitted by the Russian Federation to the text of the draft resolution contained in document S/2023/773 submitted by Brazil. Rule 36 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure states the following. If 2 or more amendments to a motion or draft resolution are proposed, the President shall rule on the order in which they are to be voted on. Ordinarily, the Security Council shall first vote on the amendment furthest removed in substance from the original proposal, and then on the amendment next furthest removed until all amendments have been put to the vote. But when an amendment adds to or deletes from the text of a motion or draft resolution, that amendment shall be voted on first. Accordingly, I intend to put the proposed amendments to the vote first. I shall now put to the vote the proposed amendment to be inserted after operative paragraph 2 of the draft resolution. This amendment is contained in document S/2023/775. Will those in favor of the proposed amendment to be inserted after operative paragraph 2 contained in document S/2023/775 please raise their hand? Against? Abstentions? The result of the voting is as follows. 6 votes in favor, 1 vote against, 8 abstentions. The proposed amendment has not been adopted, having failed to obtain the required number of votes. It's after. Okay. I shall now put to the vote the proposed amendment to be inserted before operative paragraph 1 of the draft resolution. This amendment is contained in document S/2023/776. Will those in favor of the proposed amendment to be inserted before operative paragraph 1 contained in document S/2023/776 please raise their hand? In favor. Against? Abstentions? The result of the voting is as follows: 7 votes in favor, 1 vote against, 7 abstentions. The proposed amendment has not been adopted, having failed to obtain the required number of votes. The representative of the Russian Federation has asked for the floor.
Господин председатель, уважаемые коллеги.
Distinguished Mr. President, distinguished delegates, the vote on the immediate ceasefire and on an unequivocal condemnation of the indiscriminate attacks did not get passed. Those delegations who either abstained or voted against essentially were against the cessation of a bloodshed in the Middle East. There can be no other explanations of it. Of course, the colleagues here saying, well, their justification was it was not balanced. But all of these complaints are just going to be empty. You've made your choice, however, and you are going to have to bear responsibility for it to the countries, people of your countries, and to the people in the region, and the people who are living under this terrible, deadly threat. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. It is my understanding that the Council is ready to proceed to the vote on the draft resolution contained in document S/2023/773 submitted by Brazil. I shall put the draft resolution to the vote now. Will those in favor of the draft resolution contained in document S/2023/773 please raise their hand? Will those against? Abstentions? The result of the voting is as follows: 12 votes in favor, 1 vote against, 2 abstentions. The draft resolution has not been adopted owing to the negative vote of a permanent member of the Council. No. The draft resolution, no. I now give the floor to those members of the Council who wish to make statements after the vote. Right. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Brazil. Dear colleagues, at last Friday's closed consultations, Council members asked for Brazil's leadership in our capacity as presidency in October to facilitate a Council response to the escalating crisis in Israel and Palestine, in particular its humanitarian aspects. We heeded the call with a sense of urgency and responsibility. In our view, the Council had to take action and to do so very quickly. Council paralysis in the face of a humanitarian catastrophe is not in the interest of the international community. Therefore, throughout last weekend and the following days, we worked very hard through extensive and collaborative engagement with Council members to help build a unified position. While making a good faith effort to accommodate different, sometimes opposing positions, our focus was and remains on the critical humanitarian situation on the ground. Political realism guided us, but our sight was always set on the humanitarian imperative. Exactly as in other very sensitive files on the Council's agenda in which Brazil had a special role to play, international humanitarian law and human rights law provided a clear framework for action. Our proposed text unequivocally condemned all forms of violence against civilians, including the heinous acts of terrorism by Hamas and the taking of hostages. It called for their immediate and unconditional release. It also called on all parties to strictly abide by their international legal obligations, in particular those relating to the protection of civilians, civilian infrastructure, and humanitarian personnel. The draft resolution also stressed the urgent need for humanitarian access to civilians. The text incorporated urgent and multiple calls by the UN and many other actors for humanitarian pauses to allow for the delivery of aid and the voluntary safe passage of civilians. It encouraged the establishment of humanitarian corridors and other mechanisms to facilitate the smooth delivery of aid. The draft further reflected the ethical necessity to provide civilians in Gaza with electricity, water, fuel, food, and medical supplies. The necessity to be protected from forced relocation when the prevailing conditions on the ground do not ensure a safe and secure displacement. Thus, faced with heinous terrorist acts against Israeli civilians, with the forceful reaction to such acts and an ever-growing humanitarian disaster imposed on Gaza, the Council response we proposed was robust and balanced. We are grateful to all Council members who engaged with us since last Friday and demonstrated a sincere and practical commitment to multilateralism. Sadly, very sadly, the Council was yet again unable to adopt a resolution on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Again, silence and inaction prevailed, to no one's true long-term interest. While we deeply regret that collective action is made impossible in the Security Council, we do hope that efforts by other actors will yield positive results. They must be prompt, effective, and substantial. Hundreds of thousands of civilians in Gaza cannot wait any longer. Actually, they have waited for far too long, to no avail. I thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the Russian Federation.
Господин председатель.
Mr. President, dear colleagues, we have just been witnesses once again of hypocrisy in the double standards of our American colleagues, not standing in principle in the Security Council. They really did not want to have any solution found here. So because of this, they had to just... Now, I'm not going to waste your time on going on about this. I think it's crystal clear what's happened. But I would just like to talk about what the head of Lockheed Martin, James Head, said yesterday, talking to the American media. He said there's no point in restraining Israel from any military actions. What is the point? In the future development of our military-industrial complex, which will increase by at least 2% of GDP. There are conflicts which need to be resolved with arms, and we are prepared to provide these arms, these weapons, end of quote. As we say, no comment. Really, that is the very essence of the US's policy in the region and the Pacific region. We do hope that thanks to that, our international partners, after today's votes, will have no illusions about that and what they're intending whatsoever. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation, and I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. Colleagues, as we meet, President Biden is in the region. His trip is a clear demonstration of the fact that the United States is actively engaging at the highest levels to secure the release of hostages, to prevent the conflict from spreading, to stress the need to protect civilian lives, to address the humanitarian crisis facing Palestinians in Gaza, and to demonstrate to the Israeli people that the United States stands with them in their time of sorrow and need. We are on the ground doing the hard work of diplomacy, and while we recognize Brazil's desire to move this text forward, we believe we need to let that diplomacy play out, especially when Secretary General Guterres, President Biden, Secretary Blinken, and regional actors are engaged in intensive dialogue on the very issues we are deliberating on today. Yes, resolutions are important, and yes, this Council must speak out, but the actions we take must be informed by the facts on the ground and support direct diplomacy efforts that can save lives. The Council needs to get this right. Colleagues, the United States is disappointed this resolution made no mention of Israel's rights of self-defense. Like every nation in the world, Israel has the inherent right of self-defense as reflected in Article 51 of the UN Charter. Following previous terrorist attacks by groups such as Al-Qaeda and ISIS, this Council reaffirmed that right. This text should have done the same. Though we could not support this resolution going forward, we will continue to work closely with all Council members on this pressing issue, just as we will continue to reiterate the need to protect civilians, including members of the media, humanitarian workers, and UN officials. And when I talk about the protection of civilians, I mean all civilians. The United States is horrified and saddened by yesterday's explosion at the Ali Arab Hospital in Gaza. We mourn this tragic loss of life. On the humanitarian front, we are working with Israel, its neighbors, the United Nations, and other partners to address the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. It is critical that food, medicine, water, and fuel begin flowing into Gaza as soon as possible. Families, the elderly, and children are in dire need. Let's be clear. Hamas's own actions have brought this on, this severe humanitarian crisis in Gaza. And Hamas has caused so much needless suffering, death, and destruction. Every member state should condemn Hamas's terrorism and cruelty, and every member state should call on Hamas to cease its endless barrage of rockets against Israel. This is not complicated. It's not controversial. This is the bare minimum. Colleagues, at this difficult moment, let us all call for the protection of civilians and unequivocally condemn Hamas. Let us all affirm Israel's right of self-defense and support the urgent diplomatic efforts underway. Let us stand with the UN and other partners as they work to alleviate the humanitarian crisis facing Palestinians in Gaza. And let us all support equal measures of justice and freedom for Israelis and Palestinians alike. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States, and I give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. Malta voted in favor of the draft resolution tabled by Brazil. Malta has also abstained on the 2 amendments proposed by the Russian Federation. Although we have no issue with the substance, we saw no reason to alter a well-crafted resolution that rests on a delicate balance and that sought Council unity on this critical matter. We deeply regret that We deeply regret that the draft resolution was not adopted and remain gravely concerned at the highly volatile situation in Israel and Gaza. Notwithstanding this decision, the Council must critically remain seized with the matter and strive to work towards constructive steps which prioritize the protection of civilians and prevent any potential regional conflagration. Within this context, Malta unequivocally condemns in the strongest possible terms the barbaric terrorist acts perpetrated by Hamas on Israeli soil and against the people of Israel. Malta emphasizes that Israel has the right to self-defense in the face of such violent and indiscriminate attacks. It has the right and obligation to protect its territory and its people in line with humanitarian and international law and the principles of distinction and proportionality. We also reiterate our call on Hamas to unconditionally and safely release the hostages immediately. President, we deeply regret that casualties of this war have already included numerous medical, humanitarian, and UN staff. Hundreds were killed in yesterday's horrific strike on the Al-Ahli Baptist Hospital in Gaza that was sheltering thousands of displaced. Such actions are deplorable. They are a blunt breach of international law, which categorically prohibits endangering civilians, medical staff, and humanitarian establishments. This is the inevitable result of the military operations that are being conducted in Gaza, one of the most densely populated places on earth. Decisions to cut off electricity, water supply, and refuse supplies of aid and fuel are also deeply concerning and are leading to catastrophic results. The evacuation order, which displaced over 1 million people to South Gaza, has had serious humanitarian consequences. Such decisions are inconsistent with international humanitarian law and must be rescinded. Malta also stresses the crucial importance that there be a rapid, unhindered humanitarian access to Gaza and urges the immediate establishment of humanitarian corridors in this regard. At this juncture, the importance of preventing a regional spillover is critical. It is therefore imperative for all parties to exercise maximum restraint and fully comply with the norms of international law. Our efforts moving forward must be steadfast in aligning with a just and comprehensive resolution of the Middle East conflict. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
谢谢。
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, the night before last, I already gave a comprehensive account of China's views on the current situation in Palestine and Israel. In the next emergency meeting, I shall elaborate on China's position. I shall focus on China's position on today's vote, on the fact that the draft resolution failed to be adopted, and our reaction is that of shock and disappointment. The night before last, the Russian resolution focused on the situation in Palestine and Israel, focusing on the protection of civilians. And that resolution adopted received a lot of support from countries. However, some countries have chosen to cast a negative vote. The reason given at the point was that they were actually more intended to base their positions on the resolution tabled by Brazil, so to get more time to deliberate. The colleagues from Brazil and other colleagues have agreed to that request by postponing the meeting for another 24 hours. And now it's been proposed again to this point. Over the past 40 hours, they have neither commented on nor expressed opposition to the Brazilian draft, and which led us to expect that today, hopefully, they will vote in favor of this resolution, and the Council will be able to adopt the resolution favorably. However, the final result of the vote is nothing short of unbelievable. It is also the belief of China that the Brazilian resolution still has rooms for improvement. It should send a strong message asking for ceasefire and protection of civilians so as to prevent humanitarian catastrophe. Therefore, China has proposed amendments that are intended to improve the draft, while at the same time agreeing with the Russian amendments. On the Russian amendment, the fact that it failed to be adopted, we are very disappointed. That being the case, in view of the fact that the situation in Gaza is deteriorating rapidly, what happened yesterday, that is the airstrike on the hospital and things like that, resulted in civilian casualties in the hundreds. Therefore, the Council has to take rapid actions. China condemns strongly the airstrike against hospitals, and we urge Israel to effectively abide by the obligations under the international humanitarian law. We call for ceasefire and protection of civilians so as to prevent further civilian casualties. The draft resolution tabled by Brazil in general reflects the general view of the international community, representing the initial steps to be taken by the Council to achieve a ceasefire. And they could be possibly the only possible draft that the Council can reach consensus on under the current circumstances. Some countries are already saying that the Council should take a correct action. However, the way they voted on the text in question makes us doubt their willingness for the Council to take real actions and their willingness to find a solution to the problem. In the final analysis, the Council should not stand on its hands. The current situation in Gaza is escalating. More and more civilians are paying the prices with their lives and bearing the brunt of the conflict. And therefore, on the question of ceasefire and cessation of hostilities and protection of civilians, the Council has to effectively shoulder its responsibility and play its due role. Thank you.
I thank the representative of China for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Mr. President, Mozambique wishes to commend Brazil and your presidency for the excellent leadership in conducting this work, which is thorny but important. We also thank you for providing the Security Council with a very valuable text. We have voted in favor of the draft resolution. We deeply regret that the draft could not be adopted due to a veto. In voting in favor, Mozambique wishes to express our deep concern over the outbreak and escalation of violence and deterioration of the situation in Gaza, and consequently, the unfolding humanitarian crisis. Moreover, we are deeply concerned about the human lives that are being lost on a daily basis since the conflict erupted. The civilian population, mainly children, women, and the elderly, are suffering the most from the atrocities and the grave effects of this war. In supporting this resolution, Mozambique associates ourselves with the collective efforts of this Council aimed at ensuring the protection of civilians and the respect for international human rights law, international humanitarian law, the Geneva Convention, as applied to this conflict both in Gaza and in Israel. It is our strong call that humanitarian aid must reach the needy populations in Gaza. That includes the provision of essential goods and services, as well as medical supplies. Mr. President, we are conscious of the fact that ultimately humanitarian problems need political solutions. This belief reflects our own experience, originated from our protracted struggle against colonialism, racism, and apartheid in the Southern African region. In this context, we urge all the parties to immediately stop attacks, refrain from further violence, and engage in constructive dialogue. Mozambique firmly believes that Israel and Palestine can only resolve their differences through dialogue. We hold the view that peace is always possible if the conflicting parties are genuinely willing to follow the path of justice and tolerance. We therefore wish to reiterate our appeal to the members of this Council to redouble our efforts toward a sustainable solution to the Israeli-Palestine conflict. We believe the Palestinian people and the Israeli people have their inalienable right to statehood. They can live together, side by side, in peace and security as good neighbors. As a matter of fact, the Charter compels the parties, and indeed the entire international community, to practice tolerance and live together in peace with one another as good neighbors. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ghana.
Thank you, Mr. President. And let me begin by thanking your presidency and all delegations for the efforts made to have a consensual resolution that could have helped support the efforts of this Council to de-escalate the rising tensions and respond to the tragic situation that we are all witnessing in the Gaza Strip and in southern Israel. We deeply regret that the resolution could not pass. For Ghana, we have always held that the Council should, as far as possible, speak in one voice on this important dispute, whose fault lines reach many distant parts of the world. We have therefore from the very beginning given priority to the efforts entrusted to the presidency to lead all of us in that direction. It was in this regard also that we voted in favor of the Brazilian draft resolution, but deemed it important to abstain from the draft resolution proposed on Monday night and the amendments to today's resolution to preserve the broadest possible agreement that was found to guide us in a common direction. Despite the high sensitivities of the decades-old Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the differences in approaches we may have in resolving it, what should be paramount is our historic responsibility as a council to deliver the two-state solution and preserve the lives of the two nations whose destinies are bound by history and a common and shared area. The Council's inability to act on its responsibility today, however, should not break our resolve. We believe that a united Council voice and action on the matter is still required and critical in stabilizing the situation and assisting the parties to enter into dialogue, which is the only viable path to durable peace. We should therefore continue to ask the parties to de-escalate, seek consensus to support mediation efforts, and knock on the doors of all those that can have a moderating influence on the parties to open up the space for dialogue. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ghana for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Japan voted in favor of the resolution because it can support its main ideas, bearing in mind various perspectives, including the humanitarian situation in Gaza. Japan has unequivocally condemned the terror attacks by Hamas and others, and called for the immediate release of those who were kidnapped. We feel strong indignation at the tremendous damage and harm to innocent civilians brought by the attack on a hospital in Gaza City on the 17th. At the same time, we would like to point out that Japan had asked to delay the vote on this resolution proposed by Brazil, understanding that various countries, including the United States, have been continuing to make diplomatic efforts on the ground to improve the situation as soon as possible. Japan expresses its great regret at the fact that the resolution was voted to a vote today nevertheless. Japan has consistently and strongly supported and put the faith in diplomatic efforts by US President Biden and other relevant countries. All of us, including those who refer to hypocrisy in particular, should think twice if we are really faithful to human rights principles and if we are doing sufficient efforts to make difference on the ground in improving humanitarian situation. Actions are needed. Japan will continue to work together with other countries to ensure the safety of civilians and realize an early de-escalation of the situation. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Japan, and I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. On the 7th of October already, Switzerland firmly condemned the terrorist acts, the indiscriminate attacks and hostage-taking perpetrated by Hamas against the Israeli people. We deplore the deaths of thousands of civilians, including hundreds of children in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory, particularly Gaza. Switzerland echoes the Secretary-General in condemning unequivocally the strikes, particularly those which, according to United Nations figures, have led to hundreds of deaths and dozens of injured yesterday in the Al-Ahli Hospital, Anglican Episcopal Church. And we express our sincere condolences to the injured and the victims. We are concerned regarding the large-scale humanitarian crisis in Gaza and the dramatic situation faced by civilians. Almost 1 million people have been displaced, and it is urgent for humanitarian aid to be able to enter. Water, electricity, and medical supplies are dwindling. We have all spoken around this table yesterday about the situation in the Middle East, which requires united, urgent action by the Council. De-escalation, protection of civilians,
humane treatment for all hostages, and Switzerland calls for immediate release, as well as rapid, safe, unhindered humanitarian access are all priorities. The draft resolution tabled by Brazil met these priorities, with aiming for a common understanding by this Council, which is why we voted in favour of it and very much regret the failure to adopt the resolution put to the vote today. I wish to thank your delegation once again, President, for your sustained commitment. It is regrettable that we have not yet been able to reach consensus on a product showing our unity in the face of this situation. Independently of the adoption of a resolution, all the parties must uphold international humanitarian law, particularly the principles of distinction, proportionality and precaution, as well as human rights. International humanitarian law takes account of legitimate security and military needs. All of these rules must therefore be respected with no exception. Switzerland has deployed every effort to contribute to reaching consensus on a Council product in this urgent situation. Along these same lines, we remain at your disposal to support any new initiatives which could result in action by this Council. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Gabon.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. This morning, this Council is seeing its credibility put to the test, given the scope of the deadly violence in Israel and Gaza and the extreme gravity of the crisis in the Middle East, whose shockwave is threatening peace and security in the whole of the region and beyond. As a Security Council, our mandate is to halt wars, or failing that, to prevent them and to alleviate the human suffering born of crises. This morning, the Security Council was not equal to this mandate. The rhetoric around this table provided no succor, no help to civilians in Gaza, who are falling in the face of indiscriminate strikes by missiles and rockets, and who are deprived of all means of survival. Once again, politics and geopolitics have paralyzed this Council's capacity for action. This Council is not reacting in the face of horror and the screams of distress of civilians, in the face of one of the most serious crises in the Middle East, and we are counting the deaths and the destruction whilst remaining powerless. This Council has not provided any coherent response to provide a glimmer of hope to the children, the women, the hostages, and the peoples of the world who were watching our deliberations for their survival and for saving them. My country voted in favour of the draft resolution tabled by the Brazilian presidency and the 2 amendments proposed, because it is crucial and urgent to act, having issued strong condemnations of the barbaric attacks against Israel on the 7th of October last, and recognised Israel's right to legitimate defence, whilst upholding the principles of proportionality and distinction with regard to combatants and civilians. We firmly believe that given the magnitude of the deadly violence, which over a few days has caused thousands of deaths and immeasurable humanitarian distress, we must call for an immediate cessation of hostilities and the opening of humanitarian corridors to alleviate the suffering of civilians. Our position has been clear since the first Council meeting. Hostage-taking is unacceptable and unjustifiable and indefensible, and we reiterate the hostages must be released with no conditions, no blackmail. We regret the fact that the Council was unable to overcome its divisions. We must certainly show greater responsibility so as to find a solution to the crisis in the Middle East, whose chronic nature questions our credibility and tarnishes our reputation. For Gabon, the 2-state solution is the only credible alternative. We can and must achieve this through diplomacy, good faith negotiation, and overcoming fears and self-interest, which are distancing us from our collective responsibility of maintaining peace and security in the region and beyond. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Gabon for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. And let me start by thanking you for your good faith efforts to negotiate this resolution. The draft resolution on which we have just voted rightly condemns the appalling Hamas terrorist attacks on Israel on the 7th of October. It also makes clear that all actions need to be taken in line with international humanitarian law. It stresses the importance of ensuring humanitarian access and protecting civilians, and emphasises this Council's shared priority of preventing regional escalation of the conflict. We welcome and support the draft resolution's attempts to set out the Council's view on these critical points. But the draft resolution needed to be clearer on Israel's inherent right to self-defense in line with the UN Charter after Hamas attacks killed over 1,400 people and took almost 200 people hostage. The draft resolution also ignored the fact that Hamas are using innocent Palestinian civilians as human shields. They have embedded themselves in civilian communities and made the Palestinian people their victims too. For these reasons, the United Kingdom abstained on this resolution. My Prime Minister has been clear that the UK stands with Israel in the face of these atrocities. We support Israel's right to defend itself against Hamas, take back the hostages, deter further incursions, and strengthen its security for the long term. In so doing, we will continue to call on Israel to take all feasible precautions to avoid harming Palestinian civilians and to act in line with international humanitarian law. We will continue to work closely with Israel and our partners in the region to respond to the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, to ensure that civilians are protected and have access to food, water, medicine, and shelter, and to work towards the peace and stability promised by the two-state solution. I thank you, President.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Señor Presidente.
President, we voted in favour of the draft tabled by the Brazilian presidency, as did many other members of this council. It was the result of a constructive collective negotiating process by all members of the council. And we are convinced that the collective work and negotiation in good faith are indispensable for effective multilateralism. And these are the best way to fulfill the responsibilities placed upon us. We fully believe, President, that the Council cannot continue in silence in the face of events which are clearly a threat to international peace and security, and which are already having serious humanitarian consequences. The Brazilian presidency's draft includes elements which are necessary in the face of a situation which is worsening by the minute. The credibility of the Council depends upon our decisions at times like this. In this regard, Ecuador abstained with regard to the amendments. since these are elements which are covered in the resolution. We regret the fact that once again the Council was unable to adopt a resolution through the use of the veto. But this is not the end of our efforts. We will do everything within our reach to ensure that the Council can very soon pronounce itself and act with regard to this conflict. President, on the 24th of September 1973, the Ecuadorian Chancellor Antonio Lucio Paredes spoke before the General Assembly and said, and I quote, that it is necessary for the actions of the great powers which in one way or another support the parties to the conflict in the Middle East be guided towards seeking solutions to establish constructive peace and do not hamper possible agreements and understandings. The Middle East conflict, because of its explosive nature, compels the United Nations to tirelessly attempt to bring an end to it. Close quote. These words remain valid, even though they were said over 50 years ago. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank Brazil for their efforts, the diligence in providing time, and the continued engagement with all the Security Council members. The text came at a very critical moment, not only for the conflict between Israel and Hamas, and the huge impact it's having on civilians, but also for the revived dangers for the region and beyond. Albania voted in favor because the text responded to core objectives on the issue and to our coherent and principled position. It strongly and unequivocally condemned Hamas and its indefensible terrorist attacks on Israel on 7 October 2023. It called for the immediate release of the hostages, which should remain a humanitarian priority, as the Secretary General called upon Hamas last Sunday. They should be released immediately and unconditionally. It provided for the protection of civilians in accordance with international humanitarian law and the flow of the humanitarian aid to all those in need. It also supports the regional and international efforts for a solution on the ground and embraces a diplomatic solution to the crisis. In this respect, we commend the very active engagement at every level by the United States and others to finding the best solutions on the ground. While we supported the draft, Albania reaffirms its position in full support of Israel and its right to self-defense, like every other nation under attack, which the resolution falls short to mention. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Albania for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United Arab Emirates.
Mr. President, it is perhaps beyond me to put into words the abject horrors we are witnessing in Gaza. That is why the United Arab Emirates fully supported the Council to take action today, and we still support that the Council does take action on this situation. For more than 140 years, the Al Ahli Baptist Hospital has provided medical care and shelter for generations of Gazans. Yesterday, more than 500 Palestinians were killed in a strike that hit the hospital. Each passing hour of this ruinous war makes a mockery of these principles of international humanitarian law. Gaza is laid to waste, and nobody feels safe. We call for a full, independent investigation into this incident, and for those who are responsible to be held accountable. As we verify information about the strike, one fact still remains indisputable. More Palestinians have died in this outbreak of violence than in any other in the history of the conflict. In less than 2 weeks of bombardment, more than 3,500 Palestinians have been killed, and more than 14,000 injured. Will we continue to sit here and compare the casualties on both sides? We support no less than a full humanitarian ceasefire. We don't ask for this to be done at the expense of Israel's security, but so that people may tend to their wounded, bury their dead in dignity, and begin putting their lives back together. This ceasefire is also crucial so that vital humanitarian aid may enter and aid workers do their work safely. Mr. President, Hamas is indeed responsible for sparking this latest fire that is now engulfing the streets of Arab capitals around the region. We have called them out on this openly for the heinous attacks on the 7th of October. But make no mistake, the kindling was already there, fueled by decades of violent dehumanization, dispossession, and despair. That is why we cannot, however convenient, lose sight of the context of this crisis, the longest-going occupation in the world today of a people that do not wish to be ruled and have been let down again and again and again by all of us. Mr. President, the UAE voted for this resolution not because it is a perfect text, but because it clearly states basic principles which must be upheld and which this Council is obliged to reinforce and uphold. We really thank Brazil and its delegation for their efforts, and we remain hopeful that in the coming days we can unite behind a resolution, and that also in parallel diplomatic efforts led by the United States help lead us all off this brink that we are edging towards. As I and others said yesterday, the current escalation must drive all of us, but most importantly, Israelis and Palestinians, to the urgent work of achieving the two-state solution. Let me be clear, the only alternative to that is the violence we see right now. 3 years ago, my country established diplomatic relations with Israel. The Abraham Accords are grounded in a simple but enduring truth that peace and dialogue are better than violence and enmity. Along with our Israeli and American partners, we sought a new Middle East where coexistence and cooperation deliver prosperity, security, and peace for all. The indiscriminate damage visited upon the people of Gaza in pursuit of Israel's security risks extinguishing that hope. The region is already contending with the spillover of this crisis, and the enemies of peace are unapologetic about their aims. Let us not play into their hands. Mr. President, it has been said over the past few days that this crisis is a test for the international community and for the UN Security Council. That is true. Noa Argamani, a young Jewish woman abducted by Hamas, is in her second year of computer studies at Ben Gurion University. Her mother is undergoing cancer treatment, and she is their only child. In a conversation with a journalist about the horror inflicted on this family, Yaakov recalled that in Gaza, too, families are mourning their children. He described Israelis and Palestinians as two nations with one father, and added that we can reach true peace, and I'm praying for this to happen. Amen to the hostages' return. 22-year-old Dunya Abu Rahma, an architectural student in Gaza, is one of the thousands of civilians today fleeing south. Last night, she told CNN that up until recently, all she had been thinking about was her graduation project. Now all she thinks about is how to be safe. The test, colleagues, is whether or not we sustain that hope for peace that shines even through a parent's unspeakable anguish and a child's aspiration to just be normal like the rest of us. We cannot doom millions of people to misery because diplomacy is hard. We must keep trying again and again and again. We must recognize that by continuing to fail to respond to the Palestinian people's legitimate aspirations for a country in their homeland, we fuel this unrelenting cycle of violence and hatred. Let us not fail this test for the sake of Israelis, for the sake of Palestinians, and for the sake of all peoples of the Middle East. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Arab Emirates for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.